gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points of your #1 Pan-African channel. If you're just tuning in, this is a Talking Point where we discuss matters affecting the African continent and beyond. Today, we're discussing the privatization of security in the Sahelian region. With respect to the African continent, we shall be unpacking this in the course of this weekend edition. Just to say that the weakening of state structures is attributed to the rise of private military and security companies in the Sahelian region. The privatization of security is understood to be the fastest way to restore public force and regain control of a country's sovereignty. Based on this reasoning, the African continent would be at an intersection of two processes. That is one which is geopolitical, the failure of the international community's peace missions, reconstruction of local security forces, another which is business, that is to say international private security companies are called to areas of ongoing conflict, preferably with no hope of a quick resolution, as they are potentially very profitable. We recall that the African Union Commission President Musa Faki Mahamat, speaking in Nigeria recently during an anti-terrorism summit, voiced serious concerns posed by terrorism and violent extremism in various regions across the African continent. It should be reiterated that during the said summit in Abuja, African leaders equally agreed on the need to revamp existing institutions. As per the Togolese President for Nasik Bey, revamping these decade-old institutions was long overdue. So what are the implications of privatization of security in the Sahelian region? Join us in the course of today's edition of Talking Points. Stay with us. Thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us on this edition of Talking Point. Like we mentioned in our preamble, today we're discussing the privatization of security in the Sahelian region. We're looking at the implication of these in the sub-region and, of course, the African continent. A panel of experts today, first of all, is Dr. Elijah ENOAKU, who is the director of the Center for Africa Development. He's joining us all the way from Canada. Greetings to you, Doctor. You're welcome to today's edition.
Thanks for having me, Sharon. It's a pleasure to be on your show. I think this is my second time. Due to time differences, it's not been possible to be on the show, but it's a pleasure to be here again to discuss issues that pertain to our beautiful continent, Africa. So hopefully we'll have a fruitful discussion. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for honoring the invitation. We're equally joined by Mr. Engineer ELVIS, BANEH, who is a political analyst here in Cameroon. He is the Secretary General of the Popular Actions Party and a human rights activist with the International Human Rights Commission, the Cameroon branch. Greetings to you, sir. You're welcome on board.
Good afternoon, Sharon. Good afternoon to my co-panelists. It's true, it's been a very long while I have met with him again on any platform. Nice meeting you again, sir. Good afternoon to all of For You TV. And I must say it's a pleasure being one of your guests today.
So today, like business calls, today we're discussing the Sahel region with regards to the insecurity crisis plaguing that part of Africa as well as other parts of the African continent. We recall recently leaders converged in Abuja, Nigeria to discuss this very own topic that we're discussing today. But of course, they came up with a couple of solutions or suggestions rather on how to tackle insecurity. And today, with the recent privatization which is occurring in the Sahel region and beyond, we shall be discussing this. So I'll channel this first question to you, Dr. Elijah. Now, how does the privatization of security in the Sahel region impact the effectiveness of traditional state-led security measures?
Thank you, Sharon. The first thing I want to begin is by saying that Africa, not just the Sahel region, is at the crossroads right now. And the African leaders that be, they're using every tool in their toolkit to see how they can secure the continent and win the continent from the hands of jihadis and terrorists and bandits and all kinds of people that want to destabilize the continent of Africa. But in so doing, they are falling into the hands of this private security company. Whether you talk about the Wagner Group that's controlled by Russia, or you talk about PSC Group that's controlled by the United States, or you talk about Chinese private security groups that are in the continent of Africa. It's not just Sahel. They're everywhere. Even though we are talking about the Sahel today, these private security companies are everywhere on the continent of Africa. And when it comes to the sovereignty of Africa, this is where we need to pinpoint that while Africa is trying to stabilize the continent and every president is trying to stabilize the situation in the country, you do not do that at the detriment of the sovereignty of your nation. Because once you do that, you compromise the integrity of the boundary of your nation, you compromise security, you compromise intelligence, you reveal things about your country that any other country is going to take advantage of. So there is an inherent risk in securing the services of private security companies to advance security or to guard the continent of Africa. But every country does that. A lot of countries do that. The United States does that. Canada does that. But they do not, I repeat, they do not surrender the sovereignty of their nation to private security, which is where Africans fall in prey. Africans fall in prey because when I say surrendering the sovereignty of the nations of Africa, this is what I mean by that. You have private security companies in the continent of Africa.
That brilliant introduction, Dr. Elijah. Over to you, Mr. NJINE Elvis. You listen to your co-panelists, but what is your impression? What is your analysis of this recent trend at what we'll call the privatization of security in the Sahel region and consequently the African continent?
Well, I will just pick up from where my co-panelists ended to say to me the idea of privatizing security, especially in the Sahel region, to me, I think I would say for now it is something scary to think about. Because when we talk about privatizing security in that particular area, the question now could be, what security are we talking about? Who is to come in and what is he securing, or who is he securing? You know, it is an area where we know there are acts of terrorism still very much present there, and these different countries in these areas are still finding it difficult to eradicate such terrorist acts in that part of Africa. We know that the Western parts are still very much willing to destabilize that part of the African continent. And so when we start talking about privatizing security, and just like my co-panelists were saying, I'm afraid that we may find ourselves in a situation where people end up handing the security of their own country into the hands of foreigners who may use it as an avenue to actually come back and eventually create more insecurity in the zone, in the area, than actually trying to secure it. Now, when we talk still about security, you know, it's all about intelligence, it's all about law enforcement, it's all about armed forces, it's all about border control. And all these forces are supposed to work in synergy. They are supposed to work together. Now, when you are talking about privatizing security, for African countries, we cannot claim sovereignty when our security, which is a very sensitive part of any nation, is in the hands of foreigners. It is very, very risky. When we talk about countries like the US and other areas, it's true, they do hire the services of these private security agencies, but most often than not, these are people who are first and foremost well seated when it comes to their security, and then they know particular areas where they may dish out contracts to these different security agencies to handle, while with their prerogatives well delineated. You see, so it is important that our brothers from West Africa, from the Sahel region, when they talk about privatizing security, I would rather think that they need to sit down and rethink. I would rather encourage that these countries come together and work together, you see, to see how they can build up their security within themselves, amongst themselves, but not going towards the idea of thinking that different security agencies could be the ones to assist them in this area. We have seen in Africa before where maybe some heads of states brought in private security agencies for their own safety to maintain themselves in power. But sometimes in the future, these very agencies were the ones that started civil wars in these different countries because some of the persons leading these agencies became too ambitious and now thought that with the power they now had, they could use the military under their control to be able to seize power, because you can give power to some people, to an agency, but in the long run, you may not be capable to have total control over them again. And either the people themselves may become too ambitious, or they could be bought over by other persons who are ambitious too, and rather use them to your own disadvantage rather than what you initially thought or planned for.
NJINE. Now, this comes at meets the various call by African countries, especially those in the West African sub-region, those that have underwent coups, to send away foreign military agents from the country. We've seen that in Niger, in Mali, and a host of others. And now back to you, Dr. Elijah. What are some of the potential challenges, or better say risks, associated with relying on foreign or private security firms for addressing the problem of security in the Sahelian region?
Well, yeah, let's take a step back a little bit. When we take a step back and then we look at some case studies, it will elucidate and give us an idea of what we are talking about. So that we talk about concrete things on the ground that will give an example of the risk of some of the things that we're talking about. Let's take MINUSMA, the United Nations, even though we could call that a private security as well. United Nations forces that were stationed in Democratic Republic of Congo, there were some in Niger, there were some and so on. When they came in, their mandate was to make sure they stabilize those regions. But what we realized is that as they came into that country, they were stationed in the city where there was peace and tranquility. Fighting was happening in the east for the case of Democratic Republic of Congo, but they were stationed in the city. And when they were interviewed, they said they are in the country to maintain peace and not to fight terror. So that tells you that, number one, they do not understand the terrain and they do not understand the risk or their mandate. Number two, if you take, for example, the Wagner Group, I have no problem with Russia. I've been in Russia. I've given presentation in the BRICS forum. I was a representative in the BRICS. So this is nothing personal. Just give the facts. If you take, for example, the Wagner Group that is currently operating in the Central African Republic, that documented reports, even confirmed by the Russian Federation, of atrocities that are committed by the Wagner Group. And these atrocities range from exploiting the gold and the minerals in the Central African Republic and working with locals. I'm not talking about working with the government. They're working with the locals. Private militia groups within Central African Republic, and they're exploiting the gold and the minerals in that country for their own benefit. There are reports, documented reports that are out there. Number three, if you see in the Sahel itself, we have Turkey that's coming in. Turkey is coming in with their own private security group, and that private security group has an agenda. It's an Islamic agenda. So it's like robbing Peter to pay Paul. Okay, you're trying to fight terrorism. You're bringing in a group that has ties to similar kind of organization. So they are enormous risks that the African continent carries when it comes to private security. As I said from the beginning of my introduction, they are intelligence that every country is supposed to protect. Every country has intelligence, private intelligence, national security intelligence issues that are supposed to protect. But what do we see with this private company? When they come in, they are given access to national security archives and private information that's supposed to pertain to the state. And just to add to what my colleague said, it can lead to all kinds of things. When a private security company knows the weakness of the country, knows the downfall of the country, knows the issues, how they can easily get access to information and data and resources where people in that country, indigents in that country, cannot get access, they can exploit it for private purposes. They can exploit that. Not only that, what we see is that these private security companies, when they come into the country, which is one of the worst things that we've seen, when they come into the country, they do not rely on the local population for a lot of the things that they need in that country. They come into the country with every single thing. I will give you an example. There was a Chinese company, a Chinese private security company that was in Somalia. This private security company, while in Somalia, they brought every single thing. They brought spoons, they brought knives, they brought mattresses, they brought food, they brought every single thing. So there is no accrued benefits to the locals in such a way that they operate as a state within a state. Instead of operating as a contractor for the state, they are operating as a state within a state. That is serious compromise of the integrity of those countries in which they operate in, which African countries must be very, very careful, very, very careful. Because it is true that in the Sahel, those are indigenous schools that come from within because of people agitating for change. But we don't know what the future holds. Because when people have access to information, private information, state apparatus, state information, you do not know what they can do with that. So African countries need to take care that they are not surrendering the sovereignty of their nation to private security in the name of maintaining security for those countries, because we might pay a heavy price at the end of it.
Exactly, it's a heavy price to pay. Now to you, Mr. NJINE, you listen to your co-panelists. They have been just saying over the years that Africans should be able to find African solutions to African problems. And now with this context of insecurity, I remember Musa Faki Mahamat, the current AUC chairperson, he mentioned that the African continents would need to revamp institutions. Now, looking at all these, looking at the context per se, if we had a proper situation analysis being done on the terrain, like mentioned Dr. Elijah, do you think that this issue of security can be addressed?
I don't know if you are getting from the studio, Sharon.
Yes, I can.
Unfortunately, I don't have the feedback. I didn't get your question. I don't know if the problem is from my end.
Oh, sorry about that. So I was saying, like you listened to Dr. Elijah, your co-panelists, they have been just saying, oh, unfortunately, you can't hear us. But hopefully, we're going to get back to you. Meanwhile, we're trying to regulate what's happening. Let me take this question back to you, Dr. Elijah. Now, you've listened to a lot, you cited a lot of issues ongoing on the continent, but then you equally evoke the economic aspect of it. Now, could you say that this privatization of security on the continent has somewhat worsened the existing socioeconomic disparities that are already ongoing in local communities?
Okay, before I answer your question, let me just throw some light in the question that you asked my colleague, since he's having some technical problem, because that's a very critical question that you asked, and we need to talk about it. The question of proper African solutions for African problems. If you look at what African Union has been proposing and inter-African force, this is some of the weaknesses and the failures of the African Union. An African force to handle African problems. Instead, the African Union has failed so woefully in this area, Sharon, failed so woefully, because if you look at the conflicts that we are talking about, I mean, in Sahel, when they started, what was their solution? Their solution was to put sanctions That solution was to impose European-led, I'll say European-led because it is true that the ECOWAS and all these other organizations, they were trying to say that they should return to the million goal and so on, but they failed to look at the root causes of the problem. They did not examine the root causes of the problem. So the European Union was trying to put pressure, but they were using the African Union as a proxy because they didn't want to come out so openly as, they're the one trying to pressurize Africa. They're trying to talk about African issues where they're not African, but they use the African Union as a proxy to put pressure on this Sahel region without looking at the root causes of the problem. So this is where the African Union has been failing. Now, there was a proposal for an inter-military unit. It's part of the proposal that they're making, and it's in the preamble. You read it, you're going to see it. But so far, African countries are the enemies of their own progress. Who are those opposing the inter-African paramilitary group? The same African countries. If you look at the problem of the Eastern Bloc, how they can come together and look at an African paramilitary group that can resolve this issue locally, because African Union continues to fail the African people. Now, back to your question about the economic problem. Of course, when you have a country that is employing private security, it is not bread and butter. It is not cheap. It's not dairy. These are huge sums of money that these countries are spending to recruit this private security. It's a lot of money. So from an economic perspective, yes, it has a huge impact on the economy of those countries because, number one, the contract that you're signing, military contracts are one of the most expensive contracts. Number two, if you look at the budgets of those countries, whether you're talking about the Sahel, even though we're talking about the Sahel today, but if you look at the budgets of those countries that are involved in those military contracts, I will guarantee you, the last time I checked, most of their budget, you have between 30 to 40% of the budget dedicated to military, dedicated to security. Any country that has more than 30% of its budget dedicated to security cannot develop. It is impossible. It is completely impossible. So those are some of the economic fallout. Not only that, the training, I was talking about Turkey a while ago. If you look at the security training that Turkey is doing, Turkey is trying to train forces in Somalia and some of these countries in Africa. They are importing Turkish technology. I mean, they are not importing Turkish technology into the soil of Africa to train local military people. They train their people in Turkey and bring them to Africa. So who benefits? Is it African economies or the Turkish economy? Of course, the Turkish economy. Not only that, in terms of transfer of technology, there is no transfer of technology whatsoever. That's why you find out that a lot of African countries will send their military to Israel, to Turkey, to Russia, to France, and you see they're buried, you say, train in France or train over here. Why can't they be trained locally? So the economic downside of all this is enormous. Time for us to go through a litany of them. But again, African countries are to blame. They are unable to find African solutions for African problems. For some reason, it is a mindset because we don't seem to believe that we can have solutions to our own problems. But when you find African presidents kicking against ideas put together by their friends and say, let's have an African paramilitary group in such a way that if there's a problem, we are going to make sure that we can resolve that conflict within the African soil using African solutions. And they kick against it. That tells you that we have the wrong mindset in Africa.
Exactly. It's all about Africans being able to redefine the course of things. Now, over to you, Mr. NJINE. Hopefully, you can get us this time around. Mr. NJINE, are you with us?
I can get you.
Okay, sir. Now, how could you react on what your co-panelists said while adding how or in what ways this current phenomenon on the African continent is definitely going to impact the current conflict dynamics within local communities?
Well, when you talk about this impact, The first thing is that, like I said from the onset, I rather fear the outcome of it all, because with different agencies all over a country or in Africa as a continent, this thing is all about politics. It's all about interest. They will come into Africa, they will come to the Sahel region, they will come with their own interests. And I think my co-pilot said it already perfectly well. Some of them come, like we saw it in Mali, 5,000 troops that were stationed, 5,000 French troops that were stationed in Mali for more than 5 years. They were eventually, should I say, driven by the Malians, but terrorism kept increasing. Whereas when you go onto the field, you rather realize that they carved a zone which they secured and were rather doing gold mining than fighting the terrorists. So they came with a political agenda. They came to safeguard the interests of the French and not actually the purpose for which they claimed they were coming to Africa to do. So you understand that with these private agencies or firms, it is important we understand that in the long run, if we are not careful, they may only come in to safeguard their own interests and not even the interests of the persons or for which they were contracted in Africa. Because I always like to remind that I am one of those who believe that the Western powers or the Western countries have been or are those persons that we are never supposed to trust when it comes to any business deals, be it before the pre-colonial or to date. They have proven to us that it is all about their interest, and it is not the nature of interest where they go in for some sort of a 50-50 type of a win game. No, if they can even get everything for themselves and you don't have anything, they are very, very much comfortable about that. Secondly, when you bring in such foreign agencies for your own security, the question is, what message are you therefore passing across to the Republican military that is there? You are outrightly telling them that you do not trust them. And of course, you have dissenting voices amongst them. So even if the agencies are out to do a good job, the truth is that trouble may eventually come in from the Republican military or police or the gendarmes, depends who they are, because they would like that feel like you do not have trust in them, and they may also want to showcase something or simply outrightly keep you out of government, perhaps to bring in some other person that may eventually also have confidence in them and use them. We are talking about the maintenance of law and order in the land. When you are bringing these expatriates to come maintain security, are you sure they are versed with the laws of your land? Are you sure they are even willing to respect your own laws, even if they do understand them? Because that's another thing. You know, we are talking about people here who most often than not come to us with that white man superior concept, where they want to think that they are superior to you. And of course, you going towards them to seek their services in security is some sort of legitimizing that notion in them that they are superior, and that is why you have to always run towards them for their own services, even in matters of your own security. So they may come in and, like I earlier mentioned, will be the first even to instigate havoc in the land, because even your own basic laws of the land, they may not want to respect them. So that's another thing we need to take into consideration. Now, the business aspect of it, which Dr. already mentioned too. Remember that when you also contract these guys to come in for security, it is a good business for them. And so don't be surprised that instead of fighting for your security, they may even want to instigate more insecurity. Why? Because it gives them room, it gives their respective countries the room to continue selling their arms. After all, it is a business. They will not fabricate or manufacture their Kalashnikovs and store them somewhere in a warehouse in Germany or in Russia. No, they have to sell these weapons that they have produced. And the only easy place where they can sell them is where there are wars. And that's one of the reasons why Africa all over the place has been torn by wars, because it's an opportunity for them to constantly sell their weapons and, of course, generate income for their own countries and not for the African continent itself. And then lastly, I want to say, it comes also to the issue of employment. When you secure a contract for them, like Dr. Riley said, they will not employ our own persons here to train. They train their nationals and they bring into your land, you see. And like we were taught way back in secondary school, that before the colonial period, sometimes the people that were sent to Africa were even criminals rejected in their own country, and they were looking for some free land where they could dump them. So you even secure a contract with them. They go into their saturated prisons, take hardened criminals from there, give them some training, and then bring back to our land. And of course, they come back here, and their level of morality is even sometimes of doubtful. It's doubtful, and that's why sometimes you often hear of issues of rape and other human rights abuses on the continent. Not necessarily even because they look down low on you, but even because the nature of persons that were sent and that were trained and sent into your country were people who were already even in themselves doubtful by virtue of their morality and not even accepted in their own country. So, sincerely speaking, the idea of privatizing security, I really would have loved that the African continent, the AU, should sit down and think of getting a military of theirs, a standby military, such that when there are difficulties anywhere on the African continent, it is the AU that deploys them there to go and safeguard the interests of the Africans and the African continent. Even the UN, like Doctor said, those are people we can no longer trust them. In Mali, they were there, 5,000 French troops alongside, I don't know, about 5 or 25,000 UN peacekeeping missions there. Nothing changed. We talk about Congo here. They have been there for many years. Nothing. We talk about Central Africa. They have been there. Nothing. On the contrary, we see videos of them creating runways in the middle of a forest where UN planes fly, take off there every day with gold and things of that nature. So I really sincerely think that the best way we can go as Africans is for the AU to be revamped. Let them rethink strategies. They talk about Agenda 2065. And they had also mentioned something about eradicating wars in Africa, though we have not seen them actually fight or stop any war in Africa. But I think it is time for us Africans to rethink our own strategies and rethink our own security and let it remain in the hands of Africans and not foreigners.
Thank you, Ms. NJINE. I would like to start with you since you evoked the issue of human rights. Given you are an activist, now we've seen this issue of human rights abuses in several countries. You stated the Democratic Republic of Congo and a host of other nations. Now, away from the Sahel region, how can the countries that have been touched by some of these human rights abuses, like you mentioned, it could be on the criteria of choosing these peacekeepers, or rather still the private security agents. How do these various countries address this current problem?
It's rather unfortunate, madam, that we talk about human rights concerns on our continent, but like we say, when you have a body like the AU itself that has proven to be a total failure, it becomes a problem. Because to address the concerns when it comes to human rights issues, first, let's go back to the respective countries. The governments in place, are they even willing to collaborate? Those in the legislators, are they willing to vote in place laws that actually give room for those who commit such crimes to be prosecuted? That's the question. Now we look at the regional levels. Do we have regional bodies that actually take time to investigate such cases and be able to take actions that do matter? It is a question. When you talk about the AU, as the umbrella organization that is supposed to defend the African continent, I say it is even a total failure. To me, it is a non-existent body. So it's rather unfortunate that all these abuses are there, but at the end of the day, we have only our tears to shed, because at the level of the states, nothing is being done, or very little is being done. At the level of the regional bodies, I would say nothing is even done at that level. And now, when we look at the international courts that are there for such purposes, of course, again, it's a matter of interest. If those who commit such atrocities have forces, persons, countries behind them that do back them up, nothing ever happens to them. Of course, you know, if we come to human rights issues, we have seen entire nations, Western nations, fly into Africa to kill leaders, destroy property, kill humans, but none of them, be they their president or their country, were ever questioned or whatsoever thing. So it's rather very, very unfortunate, and that's why, as an African, I keep insisting on the fact that we need to sit as a people and think of strategies and solutions to our own. We always want to go by what we call the international community, because the international community, I will say, has never actually been for Africa. Let us think solutions to our own problems. And like Doctor said, it's sort of unfortunate that most of our problems, we are at the forefront of them all because of self-interest, because of self-centeredness, People propose ideas, but others outrightly go against them, not because the ideas are bad, but because they rather want to think of what maybe they stand to gain as individuals, or they want to think of what security they have as individuals, and so they sacrifice an entire nation, they sacrifice an entire continent for selfish reasons. So I think on the issue of human rights, it is still something that we could refer maybe to regional bodies. We refer it to the AU, but at least beginning with the different countries concerned, let they be able to put in place laws that actually take into consideration all these human rights abuses, and then see how at the level of the countries they begin to handle them. If it goes beyond them, they can move up to the regional levels or eventually get up to the AU. Though, like I said, unfortunately, the AU itself doesn't even exist. And when we look at regional bodies like the ECOWAS, sometimes it's rather unfortunate that the ECOWAS will be acting on instructions from Western parts and not based on the realities of what we all see on the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Janelle. We're back to you. Dr. Elijah, you listened to what your co-panelists had to say, and earlier on, you mentioned that most of the military personnel on the African continent most or many a time do get their training from foreign countries. And now in that line, does this privatization of security on the African continent, most especially in the Sahelian region, impact what we term regional counter-insurgency plans?
Definitely, Sharon, because if you have a regional counterterrorism plans, number one, you're dealing with people who understand the terrain. That's the first thing you have to understand. After you understand the terrain, one of the failures of these private security, especially the municipal one that were forced to leave, is the fact that they did not understand the terrain. They did not understand the local realities. These are foreigners. They don't understand the African concept of war and so in that case they could not succeed. And number two, how does it undermine the local securities? I will give us a couple of cases and what my colleague also said about human rights and all whatnot. There were cases in the Central African Republic where these private securities rape women, they extorted gold. They took over communities, and not only did they not work with the government securities, they worked with private tribal militias. Because in Central African Republic is so disorganized and so broken down in such a way that you have tribal militias. And these tribal militias cause a lot of havoc, documented evidence. So if you have private securities that are supposed to come in there and put in law and order or fight terrorism, actually working with the people that are causing terror, what does that tell you? That tells us that these people are undermining the efforts of local security forces. They're undermining because they know that after a while they're going to be gone and you're going to be left with chaos. Number two, in the case of human rights, I am still to read a report of documented prosecution of those who commit atrocities in the continent of Africa, those private security companies, whether it is Mali, whether it is Somalia, whether it's Central African Republic, whether it is Niger, whether it's in Cameroon or any country in Africa. I am still to read one single report of atrocities that are committed in the continent of Africa by private security companies. I haven't read any that have been prosecuted. Now, any of them brought to the law or jailed or anything? None. That should tell that these people are operating with impunity on the continent of Africa. Now, the way they further weaken the institutions of the state is this. When a country recruits private security agents or companies, it is already considered sometimes, even though there are parameters which we use to define failed state, but within some quarters, even without applying those metrics and parameters, they consider those countries as failed states. Countries that are not able to supply security for their own people and have to rely on foreign entities or foreign companies, private, in that case, private entities, to supply security to their people are considered like failed states. So look at it from an economic perspective that we just talked about. When you have a state that is undergoing that kind of transformation, undergoing those kind of challenges, you cannot talk about development. They cannot borrow money. They can't go to the IMF. They can't go to the World Bank. They have to go to maybe to China. And when they go to China, what happens? China is going to give them loans with strings attached. And a lot of them get caught up because of this. So time will fail us to go through the challenges, the risk that African countries are facing when they go with these private securities. But again, like I said from the beginning, the challenges in Africa are enormous. If you take a country like Niger, for example, or Mali, they have huge borders. It's very difficult to secure those. My solution and my idea is all these countries should be integrated into the African Union, whether they are military or they're civilians. Let's look for African solutions to African problems. They should be integrated and let a paramilitary African group that understand the terrain, understand the people, understand international, let them find solutions into this problem. And not only that, if we use the paramilitary group that is an African Union base, in terms of cost, you're dealing with less than 1/10 of the cost to those countries. But if you go out there and hire a private security company, you're talking about a huge percentage of the national budget that is going to go into sponsoring, keeping, maintaining, and training these people on the African soil. So there are solutions that African countries can easily implement. So that is my proposal on the way forward on this issue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elijah. We'll be coming back to the impact on development. Meanwhile, we'll be stating the feasibility of this paramilitary force for the African Union subsequently. And now, Mr. Engineer, now you listened to your co-panelists, but from your point of view, listening to what he had to say, could we say that the lapses or some of the limitations involved when it comes to African countries being able to actually bring into account these private security agents kind of puts a question on the strength of their various institutions, or rather their structures?
The strength of
their institutions, the various institutions across African countries put in place.
Can you come again, please?
Yeah, okay, so I was asking that, listening to your co-panelists, now when he says that African countries, for instance, are unable, like you mentioned earlier, to hold accountable these private security agents that are being contracted in African countries. Now, the challenge or some of the limitations of these African institutions or governments to be able to hold accountable these agents, could we see that as a weakness of some of their institutions?
Well, if you contract someone and at the end of the day you cannot hold him accountable, of course there is a weakness somewhere, there is a lapse somewhere. And I don't even want to go to the extent of you having to contract such a person in the first place before ending up not having the means to be able to get him accountable. I am not even in support of the idea of the privatization scheme. You see, so to me, it is a risky something. It is true that individually, countries may be faced with certain challenges and may want to turn into privatizing their security as an option. But personally, I really do not, I will be the last person on earth to want to encourage such a move. I would rather prefer to insist on us and as Africans thinking of a standby military under, or a standby force under the AU, such that whenever and wherever there is a problem on the African soil, such a force should be deployed to handle the issues in that part of the continent. The idea of the privatization, sincerely speaking, is an idea that I personally do not buy, because to me, the truth is that at the end of the day, it only exposes the continent the more. It exposes the different countries the more. When you bring in foreigners, I have said it's all about politics and interest. They may even do what they have to do, but they will also spy on you. Because at one point you are not the person depending on them. They are not depending on you. They exploit you financially. You see, they take it as an advantage to sell their arms. They take it as an advantage to employ their own population. But most importantly, again, and which is even the most dangerous part of it, they spy on you because they know all your weaknesses, and a time may come when they even use it now as a bait, where you may find yourself obliged to be able to see to them certain things, maybe resources or other issues, just because you now know that you are at a disadvantage position. So let us, to me, I don't want to think of the idea of having to contract a foreigner to secure your country for you, and then before you end up not being able to be able to hold him accountable.
Thank you, sir, for that contribution. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just tuning in, this is a talking point over your #1 Pan-African channel. But today we're discussing security in the Sahelian region of the African continent with regards to the privatization of security. Of course, our guest, our panel of experts today is Dr. Elijah ENOAKU, who is the director of the Center for Africa Development. And we equally have Mr. ELVIS, a political analyst, and he doubles as a human rights activist. Notwithstanding, he is the Secretary General of the Popular Actions Party. Now back to you, Dr. Elijah. You listened to your co-panelist who shares the same opinion as you with regards to this integration of a paramilitary force within the African Union. Back to that, you mentioned that earlier on, but we have several regional forces across the African continent. We have that in the southern part of Africa, the SADC. We equally have in the eastern part of the African continent. How feasible is an integration or fusion of all these different regional forces into forming what we'll call a paramilitary standby force? Because we had precedents that reiterated the need for this where they were discussing the anti-terrorism summit in Abuja. How feasible is this on the African continent? Dr. Elijah, please can you unmute your mic?
I'm not muted. I'm not muted.
Okay, please write in your contribution.
Good. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, as I was saying, the regional blocks that we have in Africa right now are toothless bulldogs. Those regional blocks, as I tell you, they are completely toothless bulldogs. They only bark, they can't bite. So those regional blocks are not effective. Why? Number one, we've seen regional blocks in Africa being manipulated by the West. We have case studies, because sometimes when we speak like this, it's not just speaking like analysts or specialists or experts. We have case studies. Take the case of ECOWAS, for example. See how Ivory Coast military found themselves in Mali and were detained by Malians. And it went through wranglings upon wranglings before this military were released. That is supposed to be an ECOWAS bloc that is supposed to cater for the needs of that whole bloc by itself. But you have one party being utilized by the West to stabilize the others. So African regional blocs are toothless bulldogs. Take CEMAC, for example. If you look at CEMAC, we had a problem that happened in Gabon. We had a problem in Central African Republic. We currently have a problem in Chad. That many people were killed, that you know. We have a conflict that's happening in Cameroon as we speak. So what has CEMAC? You are broadcasting in Cameroon. You tell me, what has CEMAC been able to do? In any of this country, tell me a concrete plan that CEMAC has put in place, because they have also a military wing, not established, just agenda planning. They have that wing. Ask yourself the question, what have they been able to do in all this conflict? So regional blocks in Africa are completely non-existent as far as I'm concerned. Those regional blocks should be disbanded and let a regional bloc be formed so that Africa can have a concrete African bloc that is military that can take care of this thing. Number two, if you look at what is happening here, let's go a little bit into some of the challenges that private security are going to pose. If you have a country that is having very bad relations with another country, let's take, for example, just for the sake of our discussion, let's say you have a Turkey there that is having a bad relationship with Cameroon, for example, where you are, and then you have Turkey paramilitary forces that are stationed in Central African Republic. What do you think is going to happen to Cameroon that is having a poor relationship or maybe a conflict with Turkey, but they have their private forces stationed on the corridor? That's the problem we're having between Ukraine and Russia right now, because of the fact that NATO wanted to station their private, want to have their agenda or their paramilitary or whatever it is they wanted to do in Ukraine, and Russia had to kick against. So these are some of the issues that African countries fail to understand, because paramilitary group, even though you call them private security, they have interest. Countries that supply them have interest, and they will use that at every means possible to get what they want on the continent of Africa. If they cannot get it through the country where they are located, they will use it as a proxy to get to the next country where they want to get. So African countries should understand that there are risks associated with these paramilitary groups. Now, when it comes to, my colleague, NJINE ELVIS, mentioned about spy agents, it is well known. When it comes to spying agents, it is well known. You can use every means available. You can use intelligence. You can use spies. You can use private security. When the African continent is relying on these private groups, you are surrendering. I already mentioned at the top of the discussion, you are surrendering the sovereignty of your nation, because when those people come in, they will get every single information that they can get. Today, you can be friends. In diplomacy, we say they are not permanent enemy or permanent friends. We only have permanent interests. Today, you can be friends with country A, and they're supplying you private security and the information they gathered from your country. Tomorrow, you could be enemies. They are going to use that information against you. When you become enemies or your interests don't align, they're going to use the information they gathered and all what they knew about the country against you. So that is why I keep coming back to this issue of sovereignty when it comes to private security. African countries should not surrender their sovereignty, even if you are in problems in terms of security, you're trying to secure your borders. Make sure that those private securities are operating within their borders, because some of them, when they come, they do not even understand the legal system in the country in which they're working. They're operating under their own laws, under their own, they don't follow any law in those countries. They go wherever they want to go, they do whatever they want to do, and they do that with impunity. That is not the right Africa to take. But an African group, an African Union group, paramilitary group that is stationed in Africa, understand the local reality, understand the people, and will definitely, I say definitely, because, for example, if you have a Nigerian force that's stationed in Cameroon, those are neighboring countries. The laws are similar. The people are similar. I'm talking about Cameroon Anglophone. Or you have a Cameroon force stationed in Chad. Those are local realities. They understand the people. They understand the law. They know what's happening on the ground. They're able to work within the confines of those laws and the legal system. But you're bringing somebody from far away Europe or North America to come and keep peace and tranquility in a country where he knows nothing about. He will operate with impunity. That's what's happening in Africa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elijah. We now proceed this edition of Talking Point, today's discussion. Now, Mr. Engineer, what role do the population or the masses of every nation, like you mentioned from your co-panelists, what role do they have in ensuring that a country can be able to maintain its sovereignty and as well ensure its own security?
Are you talking about the population?
Yes, sir.
Well, I think we can simply call on the Ubuntu spirit, though it is a concept today that has become so frequent to hear people use on the African continent, but few are those who are actually willing to put it into practice. I think Africans will need to really be patriotic and stand for their countries. When I say Africans, I mean the population, I mean the leaders, I mean just everybody. We need to know who we are, we need to know where we come from, and we know where we are going to. If we grow with that patriotic spirit for our respective countries and then the African continent per se, we shall not even get to the point of having to bring in expatriates to serve as security agents in on our continent. Also, or like we say, since there will always be issues around the world, wherever or whenever there will be a problem on the African continent, we will be the same persons to be able to go there and see how we can secure such a place and talk some sense to our own very brothers so that life could go back to normalcy. So I think that is just my message I can pass across to the African population. We should be patriotic. We should learn to love ourselves and love our continent. We should learn to listen to one another, and when others have ideas that could be of help to the continent, we should see how we can promote such ideas, and rather than refute ideas simply because of maybe particular interest that we may want to safeguard or so.
Thank you, Ms. NJINE. Now proceeding, earlier on, Sir Dr. Elijah, we mentioned that African leaders had evoked as a suggestion to revamp institutions across the African continent. And now, as an expert, you are equally an expert or the director of the Center for African Development. How feasible is this within the context of the African continent?
I think it is very, very possible. But it first of all begins with the willpower. Do we first and foremost have the will to do it? If the will is there, then I think it is very, very feasible. And I would say the first thing would be that we move towards, when I say we, I mean some of us or Africans who may have the possibility to move towards independent states. We first of all propose to them ideas. You see, let at the level of, we can propose bills that can be voted into law that promotes unison within amongst the African countries. You see, that's the very first thing. We should move towards our different countries and be able to propose ideas to them, to the leaders. And that's why I say it begins with the willpower. If the leaders themselves are even willing in the first place to be able to sit and listen to ideas that people can propose to them, and then they actually act upon them in all objectivity and in all honesty. Now, coming back to the issue of our own, should I say, the Republican military that we may have across the African continent, we can also need to check on the morality of the persons we also get into offices or into the military, because sometimes when we see leaders moving towards getting foreign agencies, it is like I earlier mentioned, it is because there is some sort of disconnection in terms of trust with the existing Republican military, and so it becomes a problem. So we should also have to look in that direction. There should be sanctions for those who violate rights. But in a nutshell, madam, when you ask about the feasibility, I say it's very, very possible. Let the willpower be there. Let people begin at the level of their countries and then move to the regional levels. Maybe when at the regional levels, 3, 5, 6, 7 countries can be able to agree on something that can work within their own sub-region, then gradually we see how we can integrate the ideas from all the different sub-regions. And of course, if all these sub-regions accept or agree on something, obviously we are talking about the African Union. So I think that the willpower first should be the first thing that we take into consideration. The objectivity of our leaders, they should be people who speak African, who reason African, and see everything African. Doctor said something right from the beginning of this program, which is very, very important and very, very pathetic at the same time, that we have problems that are African, but we discuss them on other soils out of the African continent. It does not make sense at all that you see all African heads of states travel to go to China, to France, to Russia, to the US to discuss pertinent issues about maybe insecurity on the African soils, when they can sit down here as a people, discuss as the elders that some of them are, and of course, as leaders that they all are, and think of possible solutions without necessarily having to let the neighbors hear about the problems we are facing. Sometimes it's pathetic that we see them propose ideas to resolve similar issues in other parts of the world, like in the Russia-Ukraine war, whereas similar issues are going on here on the African soil, but we barely hear them talk. So I think the willpower is the very first thing. Let our leaders, first of all, have that love for continent, have the love for the people, and then, of course, give an open ear and create avenues where experts from different fields can come together, propose ideas, objective ideas. We all sit together as a people and work on them, and then see how we can implement them for the general good of the continent.
Thank you, Mr. Engineer. Back to you, Dr. Elijah. Do you share the same opinion as your co-panelists with regards to revamping institutions on the African continent?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. But I will add a little bit about, let me take a step back about the question you asked about the role of the population. This is very important and very crucial, because that's one of the things that we do at the center. We work with the local population and work with governments in terms of identifying the data. We work on data. We are more data driven. Look at what the problem is, run the data, what the people are looking for, do feasibility studies, and then work with private institutions, research institutions, and governments to present this data to them as to what we think is the solution to a problem that the country is facing. Now, in terms of the role that the population should play, it is very, very important for us to discuss this. Maybe a different show or a different time, we can go into length on what is the role of the population in all this. We are talking about security, and security comes because there's war. The root cause of the problem is because there's war or there's some sort of a conflict happening in the continent. The population should ask themselves the question: when you have your country and you have more than 30% of your budget being used to maintain peace, who suffers? Who suffers? Everybody suffers, including the people that are fighting that war. Everyone suffers. So the population needs to think back and say, we are fighting this war. What are we fighting for? At the end of the day, am I benefiting anything from this war? Not only that, advocate for change. There are many countries in Africa, Mr. NJINE is a young man, he's a political leader, but we ask yourself, how many people of his age and our age and young people down the road are actually involved in civil discourse, making people understand that it is our responsibility to make things happen? How many people have registered to vote? How many people are discussing when it comes to issues of development and conflict and so on? How many are interested? I run a very big website and a very big Facebook group. We talk about different things, social life and so on. When you bring one political issue about civil discourse, you see everybody run away. I'm talking about almost all my followers are Africans. When you bring a political discourse, let's discuss about what's happening in Cameroon, what's happening in Niger, what's happening about Burkina Faso, in South Africa with all the crime and everything, everybody's quiet. But bring a topic about social issues, things that don't even matter, you see everybody jumping in, talk about it. So the population of Africa has a role to play to make sure that we are involved. I mean, civil discussion, civil discourse of what's happening in our country. Let's leave aside tribal tendencies and things that are going to bring conflict in the continent of Africa, because at the end of the day, when the powers that be do not have the means to maintain security, they are going to go to those private security we're talking about today. So the population have a role to play. And not only that, we saw what happened in Niger, that if there's something that's not working, the population should speak up peacefully, though, peacefully. Because when MINUSMA was driven away, the population rose up. Look at what happened in Senegal. The population, the younger people rose up. That's why they have this young president that's rolling now, is changing things. But if the young people think that You know, nothing's going to change, nothing's going to happen, or if I vote, I don't vote, nothing's going to change. We will be here because the old oligarch, with their mentality, want to remain in place forever and continue to recruit these private security companies because they know when they sign those contracts, a good chunk of the booty goes into their pockets. That's how they rule. That's how they operate in impunity. So the population has a role to play. Now, back to your question before I hand over. My colleague just talked about it, and we don't need to, belabor it that much. African people need African solutions to African problems. I already talked about it. If you look at what's happening in the continent of Africa, we have the capacity if the political will is there. It is lack of political will that is a problem. It's not because we don't have forces, we don't have people. It's lack of political will. Because if you look, I gave you an example that a group of African presidents proposed an African peacekeeping force to take place in one of the worst, not one of the worst, the worst conflict in Africa is the conflict that's happening in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. That's the worst conflict. An African group of presidents is proposing an African solution to African problem, but it's being kicked against by other African presidents. But the same African president, like I said, will prepare to go to Dublin and all whatnot to sit to discuss the same problem. So our mindset need to change. We need an African agenda that everybody can sign onto, like the Agenda 2063, but it needs to have concrete action on the ground, not on paper, Agenda 2063, or the 9 pillars are this, the 23 pillars are this. But so far, there's nothing on the ground. So we need concrete actions on the ground that will maybe give some hope to people that we can do this instead of just signing communiques and decrees and all whatnot and whatnot. Concrete action needs to happen so that Africans can have confidence that we are able to handle the future of our own continent.
Thank you so much. Staying with you, Dr. Elijah, earlier on you mentioned that this privatization could have a toll on the growth or development of the continent. How is that?
Oh, yes. For example, I give an example. When you have private security companies, they are not giving you at the cost of 1 cup of garri or sugar. They are giving you that services at a huge cost. Go and look at any country that is involved in war and has recruited private security and have gone into contract. Look at their budget. What percentage of their budget is allocated to security? You will see 20, 30, some of the even 50, 40% of the budget allocated to security. There is no country that can develop when you have 40% of your budget allocated to security. Instead of being allocated to development projects, infrastructure, education, health, and all whatnot, you are instead allocating that budget to security. There is no way development can come to that country. That's what I mean by that. As long as you are involved in that and you have a good chunk of your budget being allocated for security, which goes especially to private security, that is very expensive. Like I said, if you look at the security apparatus and the security services that are offered by these Western countries in private security, and compare that if a local paramilitary group was to offer the same services, it will be close to 1/10 or even less than what they're offering from the West. So it's a huge cost. It comes at a huge cost to the African continent, and it's not sustainable. No country, I repeat, no country can run on private security. It has to be the Republican security group that takes care. That's when you know that a country is stable. That's where stability comes in. Not only that, I forgot to mention, these countries that are running on private security are considered either as failed states or semi-failed states. That means when they go to the World Bank to secure a loan, when they go to IMF to secure a loan, they're going to give them a loan at almost 10 times the interest rate. A loan that the same country in the West will get for, let's say, 0.5%. They will give that loan to them at around 15 to 20% interest rate. That's unsustainable. No country can develop like that. So that is the risk that these countries are facing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elijah. Unfortunately, due to time constraint, we might not be able to really exhaust today's topic of discussion, but I'd like to close or conclude with you, Mr. Engineer ELVIS. In your opinion, what is the way forward towards this issue of privatization on the continent?
Well, I think the way forward has been discussed in the course of the program already.
Absolutely.
Yes. If our leaders have the will to resolve African problems on the African continent, there will be no need for private security companies. Because first, when we look at the wars across Africa, some of them come as a result of leadership problems. You see, people who maybe want to always modify the constitution to stay in power beyond their term of office, it becomes a problem. People who are in leadership but will not want to cater for the basic needs of their people, and so it leads into disgruntlement and then eventually sparks off into civil wars. People who maybe, like in the case of Cameroon, who want to marginalize a certain part of the population and try rather to assimilate them rather than work with them on the terms on which they ever did accept to come together, it eventually leads into a situation like the one we find in Cameroon today. So if the leadership in Africa are conscious and have the will to do good work, I want to think it will already drastically limit the number of wars we have in Africa. It will build more trust and confidence amongst Africans, and so there will be no need for us going in for private security agencies or firms. So I think I just want to call, like I earlier mentioned already, on patriotism. People should be patriotic. People should have the will to be good leaders. People should learn to understand that when you take office today, there is a time when you must leave office too, and that leaving office is not a crime. It's a sign of greatness. Let me put it that way. You see, when we put all these things together, in other words, we should even try to put in place institutions that actually do train would-be leaders. And even if we don't have such institutions, I think if you are a good leader and you are in office, you start preparing the way. You see, you start preparing other young persons who will eventually take up the baton from you, because you need to be conscious that if I'm here today, there will be a time when some other person will need to take over from me. It should not look like when you are in office, you have it in mind that before you there was no person, after you there will be no person, and so you are the only person who has to be there. No, that is not leadership. And so I think the greatest problem we face on our African continent stems from leadership, and I think if we begin to work from that premise, then I think sincerely we shall resolve so many problems, we shall curb so many wars on the African continent, and there will be no need for us going in for any form of going to contract foreigners to come in to ensure security on our African continent. Secondly, the AU should step up its game and do exactly what they are supposed to do. The AU should not just be an institution that exists on paper. We need to fill them all across Africa by virtue of what they do. Let them take their full responsibilities, because I think most often than not, when you listen to Africans talk, they will always remind you that the AU is a toothless bulldog. You see, let them prove to Africans that they are actually who they are supposed to be by virtue of what they do on the ground. Let them get their own standing force, such that in case of any situation, we.
Thank you so much, Mr. Engineer, for your contribution on today's edition of the program. I equally say thank you to Dr. Elijah for taking our time to join us on today's edition of Talking Point. Ladies and gentlemen, it's on that note that we conclude today's edition of the program. Thank you for watching. Meanwhile, I've been NJIX for presentation. Do have a great weekend in company of our programs.